All right. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the Morbid Symptoms Podcast. I'm your host, Tara Van Dyke, and I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Benjamin Studebaker to the show for the first time, hopefully not the last time. And Benjamin, let me pull up, is a, let's see. Oh, I lost my train of thought. I'll introduce you, and then you can fill in the blanks if there's anything pertinent that I missed. Benjamin did his DPhil in political theory, or I'm assuming, or political philosophy at Cambridge, and he has recently written a book that we're going to talk about in some detail. And he also, if memory serves, he co-hosts the podcast The Lack with Nina Power and some other people who I've forgotten, and I will put those links in the video description on Rumble and YouTube later. And also, I think you recently started a political theory podcast, but I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself to our small but mighty and hopefully growing Morbid Symptoms audience, Benjamin.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I did my PhD in Politics and International Studies at Cambridge. I host The Lack, the Films podcast with Nina Power, and sometimes Helen Rollins is on. I also run a podcast called Political Theory 101, which I've done with a variety of former students and friends of mine over the years. That one's been running for several years now. At benjaminstudebaker.com, that's my website. On my About page, you can see all of the stuff that I have published, including this recent book, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way Is Shut. I have a second book coming out in November called Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies that'll be out with Edinburgh University Press.
So, you haven't been resting on your laurels since you did your Viva and became a member of the guild of the DPhil guild. Yes. So what we're going to do today, of course, the main focus with what we're first going, at least a loose agenda, is I first want to talk about Benjamin's latest book, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way Is Shut. And we'll talk about what exactly that means in terms of the way is shut in particular. Then since we have him here, I want to get his hot takes, his unprepared remarks, if you will, on recent political events or non-events, especially, of course, a few days ago, the presidential debate that was or wasn't, and how people are responding to that, and what that can tell us about. Again, how I would assume he'll connect it back to how it's just another symptom of how the way is shut currently in American democracy. And then if we have some other time, I want to get his take on BRICS, and also on the back and forth that's been going on. I don't know, maybe forever. At least I've known about it for 5 years. The battle over, is the left dead or not? Is left right? A liberal binary that we need to get past. What he makes of what gets put under the MAGA communism moniker, if you will. But we'll see, because that's a lot. So we'll see how we do. But anyway, the first thing I want to do is invite Benjamin to. I'm going to put up what I think the main thesis of his book is. That's always fun, and he can let me know how wrong or accurate that is. So here's the book. And of course, I would encourage everybody to get it. It's on Amazon and other booksellers. Of course, we don't like Amazon, but if that's all you have delivered to you, don't let that stop you from accessing Benjamin's book, but it's also available on the publisher's website and other places. How I saw the thesis is, I would say that the main thesis of Benjamin's book is that American democracy is characterized by persistent deadlocks and inefficacies that prevent meaningful reform, and that the main push of it is that this is a structural rather than situational crisis, meaning it's a long-term condition, and that we see regular, repeated short-term crises, like the financial crisis or the current thing we have now about, is Biden the president really? What this means when these are the two candidates that the two main parties put forward, but that these short-term crises are resolved or papered over or pushed forward without posing an existential threat to the system itself. So, Benjamin, what would you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's really a book about how we have these enormous problems that cause tremendous suffering for people, that produce all kinds of, as you like to call it, morbid symptoms, right?
Gramsci,
as Gramsci calls
I
it.
wish
right?
I wish
morbid
that was
symptoms.
mine.
Yeah, right. So all sorts of morbid symptoms, and yet at the same time, the system is very, very durable. And the goal of the book is to kind of put both of those thoughts together at the same time. A system that produces enormous suffering is genuinely quite awful for many people in many ways, but that doesn't in and of itself mean it's going anywhere. Many people can be dissatisfied, they can critique it, they can dislike it. That doesn't give them the capacity to move on from it. And so then I'm kind of trying to work out, well, if you can't just straightforwardly have a revolution, have a revolt, change the regime, what kinds of stuff might you be motivated to do? How might your desire to have something different appear in a system where that desire is continuously frustrated? What manifestations might it have? And over the long term, what might be the long-term effects on the procedures, on the system of the things people do to try to purify it or reform it or make it work better? I think that ultimately these reforms can't actually succeed in solving the problem, because I think the problem is fundamental to capitalism and to the international system and to the system of nation states and the modern state as it exists. So it's not something that can just be resolved with procedural reforms to democratic procedures. Nevertheless, because that's the horizon in terms of what people are able to think about doing, people will continuously try to persuade themselves and others that those reforms will have effects they will not, in fact, have.
Okay. So thank you for that elevator pitch. Very good. And for those of you who don't know, the elevator pitch is that people like Benjamin and myself, if I can put us in the same category, when someone asks us about our work or opinions on something, it's easy to go on. And so people who know our mentors would say, look, you need to be able to say it in 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, etc. So that was very well done. You've inspired me. Two things, if I may. It seems that I might have noticed a bit of a contradiction in what you said, which of course is that, when we're talking off the cuff, that happens, but there is the possibility that small reforms or reforms can add up to have a structural effect, even if it was not the intention of the people who did it, especially when they conflate together. So you said at the end that people buy into things or get interested in things and are constantly then kind of frustrated when things don't work out, like voting for the squad or making sure that Trump doesn't get elected again, or maybe a 1-year child care credit or something like that. However, wouldn't you also say that we can't really know from this point what the aggregate effect is of these parts vis-a-vis the whole and the other relationships between them? If I want to go really, if that makes sense to you, the question that I asked.
Well, I would agree that in the long term, there's a horizon beyond which nobody can make predictions, beyond which nobody can see. The Owl of Minerva quote from Hegel is about the futility of very, very long-range predictions. I do, however, think that there's a medium term where we can analyze how different ideas in culture and in society and different political action and behavior, how these things are interacting, and to some degree anticipate how concepts might evolve or how political movements might evolve or change as a consequence of that interaction. So when I say that the reforms don't have effect, I mean, they don't solve the underlying problem of capitalism, of the fact that capital is highly mobile now, territorial states are locked in place, people have a difficult time moving from place to place, and that means that people and states have less leverage vis-a-vis oligarchs who control highly mobile financialized capital. That problem cannot be solved with these reforms. However, the reforms do have effects insofar as they're taken up. And those effects over time, I think, produce greater, worse, morbid symptoms that further lock up the institutions and introduce new forms of dysfunction into them. So I'm trying to kind of anticipate to some degree how the institutions of the United States might further devolve. And as they devolve, what kinds of opportunities might that create for various people?
Okay. So, in terms of that, so it seems like in terms of the if we bring in the dialectic, that you're kind of thinking we're in a negative dialectical spiral, it seems, and that will continue to be that way until something, I don't know, we have some sort of Berdouian event, or again, I know, I appreciate you can't know, and I don't in the main disagree with anything that you've said. It's hard to look around and think, oh yeah, anything seems to be going in the positive arc of history type of direction at the moment. Before we get I want to in terms of placing your book with maybe sister or cousin books, as I looked at it, and I realized, and I want to say as a disclaimer, I realize that when you're writing a book, it's very good to keep it focused and not go out into everywhere. So I realized that you were focusing on a political crisis, not every single crisis in the system. But when I was reviewing it, or skimming it, paying particular attention to the first and last chapters, as you do, what came up to my mind is the more crisis theories that's embedded in political economy. So I'm thinking just the people I'm most familiar with would be David Harvey. And of course, he even had a book, I think, The 17 Contradictions of Capital, or something. I can't remember the exact name. And also, I'll bring it up actually, because I think this is, if I was going to recommend, oops, sorry, let me remove that. A book that I think would be great to read along with yours would be Nancy Frasier. I think this is about probably 2016, maybe, that her and the Capitalism, A Conversation in Critical Theory came out. And then subsequently, she has a more condensed version called Cannibal Capitalism. But when I think of your book, you're zeroing in on the political crisis, in particular, the crisis of American democracy. So you're focused, obviously your center's American democracy, the United States. And with her book, it's more of an umbrella, because she's thinking, okay, there's a systematic crisis. So we have a political crisis, we have an environmental crisis, we have a social reproduction crisis, we have an economic crisis, we have all these crises. And so what I see your book fitting in with these is that it gives you it really zeroes in on a political crisis anchored in the United States. And so I guess, long story short, would you also see your book as a companion, or as in the same genre as these books by Nancy Frasier, if you're familiar with them? And also, how does your book relate to one of David Harvey's, maybe like 10 years ago now, I think it was The 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism, or something like that? I can't remember the exact title.
Well, my book would be more political, I would say, than those books. In terms of what I draw on, who I am referencing, there's a lot of Wolfgang Streeck, there's a lot of Andrew Gamble, there's a lot of David Runciman, there's a mix of kind of Marxist and liberal realist theories. I'm often trying to criticize some of the, like, Levitsky and Zablat, is Democracy in Trouble, this kind of literature that focuses on the United States as maybe being akin to Venezuela or Turkey. I'm pushing against some of those kinds of arguments that make these comparisons that suggest, Donald Trump seems to have a personality that's like that of Erdogan, or like that of Chavez, and therefore all of these things necessarily are dangers. I'm trying to complicate that discussion. I bring in a lot of stuff that comes from European theorists who are looking at how the economic situation in the world constrains European nation states. People like Walter Schiedel, people like Thomas Piketty, a lot of different stuff. And some Marxists too. Adorno and Horkheimer are in this. So there's a fairly wide range of different things I put together. I'm a very syncretic kind of person. I think that oftentimes the most interesting stuff comes from taking literatures that aren't normally in conversation with each other and making them talk to each other. I think there are a lot of liberal realists who get that this is a durable system, but miss how miserable it is and how much people are suffering and how much the suffering is driving their behavior. And at the same time, there's a set of Marxists and left-wing thinkers who are very sharp in terms of their critiques, but don't really understand why the thing is so durable, and so are constantly expecting it to fall apart or constantly expecting it to rapidly transform, in part because they want that to happen, because it's a very painful system. It's very painful for them. It's very painful for many people they know. So I'm very sympathetic to that motivation. At the same time, I think if we engage in wishful thinking about the trajectory of this system, we're likely to make mistakes.
No, and I think that that is a good way to do it, because I think it's too easy to get kind of very siloed. And I think sometimes if you're in academia, maybe this is that of course it behooves you not to get too quote unquote intersectional, even though that's what we culturally is popular, because, you know, the more mixer, the weaker the drink. So to be very precise and focused on something, especially for publications and all that. However, when it comes to political analysis and assessment, I couldn't agree more that it's too easy. It's almost like, and I love these guys, so don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to, you know, it's tough love. And I'm sure that I'm blind to my more magical thinking or wishful thinking. But it's almost like the end of days thing, like, you know, like this time the rapture is going to happen, or this time that, you know, like, you know, now, you know, no, now we misinterpreted the Mayan calendar. It's really going to end this thing. So it's kind of almost like, and it puts Marxists and those on the left almost in a difficult position, because it's almost like you're willing for things to get really terrible so that something will break, which of course people who are suffering don't really like feeling that their suffering is somehow, you know, a positive indication for people, at least objectively, not subjectively. And then again, the constant, you know, the disappointment then, you know, afterwards, when it just kind of, oh, you know, I guess Barack Obama, you know, it's not yes we can. It's like, well, you know, or Hillary Clinton, or if we get a diverse enough elite, that somehow this will transfix. So I get what you're saying about not wanting to, but isn't there also a danger? And this is where I think when I do give you a ribbing on Twitter, this is where it's coming from, is that there's so many, in terms of the left, whatever you want to call that, it's really top heavy with commentators, theorists, content creators, you know, and a lot of times what happens is, and I do this myself, is that we end up being in this kind of Goldilocks position. You know, that's too much, that's not enough of this, that's too much of that, so that's not going to work. Or that's, and so I think so that's where I'm kind of, when someone comes in, and also because I have a big mouth and I just decide I'm going to say what I'm going to say regardless of the consequences, people who are more careful and kind of speak aphoristically or in general terms and kind of like don't name names or get specific, I'm like, well, okay, that's only that's, no, they're probably just wiser than I am, career wise. But so I'm sorry, I'm rambling on. So isn't there also the danger of being too cynical, or not cynical, but from skepticism turning into cynicism, especially from people who are political theorists, commentators, this type of thing? Do you think there's also a case of always calling balls or strikes, but never letting anything hit, or to kind of see where it grows?
Well, I do think that there's a kind of capitalist realist position that says that there's nothing else you can do. This is all that there is. And at the extreme, that can sometimes produce excuses for the thing. So I am trying not to do that either, which is why I'm really trying to strike a syncretic balance between the critique and the apology. I think that both of those have to be present in your head at the same time to really have a realistic vision. And what people will do is, if they have the critique in their head, they'll go, well, come on, the thing has to collapse. And if they have the apology in their head, they'll go, well, it's never going anywhere. And if you have both in your head, then you might be able to get the interplay.
Okay.
When it comes to the specific arguments that I make, yeah, I think that this is where we could get into detail, right? If I am saying that something in particular isn't likely to work, we can have a detailed discussion about why I think that. And if I give good reasons for why, then that might be a reason to not view me as just being overly cynical. But if I just hand wave and I don't give any good reasons, then you might think, well, Benjamin's just got a really negative attitude about everything. My hope is that when people read this book, they'll see that there are lots of good reasons for why I think all these different things aren't going to work.
Well, and of course, I mean, the medium of Twitter or X is quite different than a podcast or a discussion or reading a book. So it's also, it encourages this kind of quick type of thing, which, like anything else, is a double-edged sword. So there's the good and the bad side of that. But I appreciate, I obviously, but I think, wouldn't you also agree? And this might just be something we can't get away from, because we think differently when we're writing than when we're talking. And I think that a lot of people, when we can turn our put our dialectical cap on when we're writing, but then when we're looking at political things in real time, all of a sudden people become very non-dialectical. So it's like, if it's this now, it's never going to change to be anything else. Whereas, and something could look really, of course, and again, we don't have crystal balls, but just to the awareness that, do we really want to undercut something so quick, so all the time, even if you have very good reasons for doing so? Does the question make sense to you, or am I?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay, good.
I mean, this is where your point at the beginning about saying that I have a negative dialectic is, I think, really important, right? If I have a negative dialectic, it doesn't just mean that I think nothing's going to change or stuff isn't going to work. It tends to mean that I think that the way people respond to the crisis will make it worse in various ways, including the things they do to try to make it better. So there are a lot of well-intentioned people who are doing things with a genuine intent to try to make things better. But when I look at what they're doing, I don't think it will make things better. If I just thought it won't help, I wouldn't be so critical.
Okay.
It's that I actually think that it's going to make things worse in some way. That something bad is going to happen as a consequence of this, both for the people who are doing it, because they're going to be wasting their time and years of their lives. But also, I often think that the way that they're intervening is making the issue or situation harder to deal with. Okay. And this is even in the case where I agree with the substantive goals that people may have.
And maybe this would be a good way to kind of segue into BRICS a bit, to put a bit of meat on those bones. So if I were to rephrase, not to go all into it, but so the idea that people are seeing, even whether they be realists or idealists, I think there's this notion that even for people who aren't, super excited about China's political system, let's say, or India's, we don't think India is the most trustworthy chain in the links chain, think that in general it's a good thing and it's a positive thing for there to be this developing counterweight, even if a lot of it has to do with the U.S. and the West's own goals, like doing things that they think is going to weaken Russia or China, that actually seems to push them to get more creative, whether it comes to trade or security or whatever. But if I understood, you're critical of this. You want to, I guess. So in terms of what you just said, in what way do you think people's enthusiasm, however cautious, for BRICS could actually end up making the situation worse without them realizing it? To put it in to kind of couch that the BRICS into the way you just described your negative dialectical approach.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that, of course, if you are in an international system where the leading state in the system is acting increasingly crazy or rogue or unreliable, and the United States is doing all of that. The United States is increasingly an unreliable partner. It's increasingly unpredictable, and countries are worried about what's going on in it. And the debate that we had the other night is not going to help in that regard, right? So I am sympathetic to the states that are trying to prepare for some possibility in which the United States loses its shit, goes crazy, and does something that really causes a lot of trouble. I'm sympathetic to the states that are trying to do that. They need to have contingency plans. The European Union, China, they need contingency plans for some kind of major disruption to Pacific trade driven by an American establishment that is insecure and is trying in some way to shore itself up. So I'm not saying that states like China should not pursue contingency plans. I'm not disagreeing with China's attempt to create for itself a backup trade system that it can use in the event that the United States tries to lock it out or push it out or kick it out of global capitalism, right? My issue here is that there's a lot of people who are living in the liberal democracies in the West who have been frustrated by their political activity in the last 5-10 years. They haven't been able to get very far. They haven't been able to make the kinds of changes they'd like to make. These people are trying to make themselves feel better by imagining that the BRICS states are going to somehow solve the problems with the world so that it will be okay that their states are dysfunctional. And for one, this provides them with an excuse to not really engage with the politics of their own states. They can instead focus on these other states. For two, it leads to a set of kind of forms of 70s leftism, forms of kind of neo-Maoism or neo-Stalinism that are, insofar as they are political movements that do have objectives in the United States or within the Western states more generally, very, very unlikely to get very far, to have much traction with the population. And then when there's an association problem, if the left becomes associated with movements that are extremely unpopular or with particular figures that are very unpopular, it poisons the well and sows salt in the fields for other people who try to do other things. So I think that not only is it a waste of time and a distraction from the really serious situation that is unfolding in the liberal democracies, right? But that also that the presence of this, insofar as it does attempt to engage with politics in the West, is causing trouble for those of us who are still looking for some kind of viable way to intervene. And I am very much for those of us who are incurably political, continuing to look for a viable way to intervene. I have not quit politics. I think if people want to quit politics because they view it as futile, if they don't want to vote, if they don't want to give their money and time to candidates and parties, one of the points of this book is that you shouldn't be wasting your time on stuff that's not going to work. So if people go, I want to check out and try to do something else, I sympathize with that. I have a chapter on enclavism, on the 4Fs, the 4 places in the private sphere that people can retreat to. And I give advice to people about the difficulties, how politics will try to get you in these spaces and drag you back into it. I'm sympathetic to people who try to avoid politics by going into other areas of life. At the same time, for those of us who are political, it's really important that our politics be motivated by looking at the real situation, what's really going on, and not by an attempt to alleviate the psychic pain of living in this situation. And when our politics becomes a way that we work on our own mental health, it often propels us to do very counterproductive things.
Okay. No, yeah, I think it would be hard to disagree with most of that. I'm sure if I put my devil's advocate on, I would say that in terms of the neo-Stalinist or the ongoing Trotskyism versus Stalinism thing that I had last week or a week and a half ago, I had a guest of the show, Garrett Ramirez, came on to explain that to me because I was really like, what the heck is going on with this thing? People calling each other trots and tankies online. It was just hilarious. I was like, is this anachronistic or what's going on? However, there's something to, and I guess this might be a pedagogical thing rather than a political, especially a short-term or medium-term thing. Now, for example, the notion that Stalin and Stalinism has been smeared and that people have very little idea about actually or a more clear assessment of what happened during that period of the Soviet Union, and that Trotsky is, all this. Again, and I'm going to say I'm not an expert at all on that period of Russian history. I can, it's easy for me to, I have no problem believing that the caricature, the idea that we have of Stalin, I grew up in the United States, obviously is very partial and propagandized. However, when you have people like, I'll just put this up because it goes to what you were saying, Jackson Hinkle and the other people who who will put up memes like this, and also they love AI, so they have these very masculine, patriotic visions of Stalin and Mao and I guess also everybody else, so Castro, Che, everybody. And I'm guessing you would say that this, however fun it might be and however provocative, doesn't have much of a shelf life in the short to medium term in terms of mobilizing and galvanizing an actual left politics in the States. But I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, and to be clear, I'm not a trot either. I would have a different set of issues if the trots were popular and we were mainly arguing with them.
Yeah.
But when it comes to this stuff, the issue with this stuff is that it's very nation statey. Mm-hmm. It very much relies on nation states to have the capacities to solve what, for me, is an irreducibly global, or at the very least, supranational problem of capital mobility. Mm-hmm. And when we start trying to compare internal institutions and try to argue that some nation states have internal institutions that are better than others, for one, I think many people who are engaged in this don't know very much about the internal institutions of the states they're talking about. And for two, it misses the fact that this is not something that can just be solved at the nation state level. So when I would be critical of Stalinism, the thing that I would be critical of is the idea that you can do this in one country or in a very small block of countries, that you can deal with global capital flows from a small position relative to the whole world. When it comes to Maoism, there's this thought that the less developed states in some way have a subjectivity that is closer to something that can resist capitalism on account of peasant subjectivity or on account of third world subjectivity. And often when Westerners espouse this kind of view, it involves orientalizing people in developing states. It involves treating them as a kind of mystic special other that has access to some kind of pre or non-capitalist way of thinking or feeling or believing that we don't have access to. And this also, again, is an excuse on the part of people in Western states not to try to solve problems themselves, not to try to think politically themselves, because they go, well, I, as a Western liberal subject, I don't have the special sauce that a peasant has or that someone in a developing state has. And this is not at all the case. We're all human beings, and we can all think about these things, and we can all engage with politics. And when we start waiting for somebody else to do it, especially somebody else on the other side of the world in a place we've never been to, who speaks in a language we don't speak, we get very, very far removed from reality really fast.
Yeah. One thing that I would say is that in terms of geography, where else can this change happen if not one country at a time, or different countries maybe at similar times, but not in the same manner? So I understand the idea that in terms of, if you have a global capitalist system and you have one country or a small block of countries trying to do something different, that becomes obviously very, very difficult because of the tools that global capital, and right now we could say, like, the U.S. at the helm of that, has to make things extremely difficult. We've seen that happen before, and we see it happen all the time, that they can put the screws to countries who want to go a different way in a variety of ways. And then, of course, that creates problems with the population, because people tend to get upset when there's high inflation and not a lot of food on the shelves and, all that stuff. And who would blame them? I mean, that is not a good place to be. However, if not one country or one place in however they're going to do that, then how else do you ever get it? You can't have it all at once. Like there's a big bang. Unless I guess you could kind of have this kind of quantity quality measure thing, like who those guys are who wrote Empire, Hart and Negri, that there's so many there's all these quantitative shifts, and that it just leaves for us to kind of make the formal recognition that we've switched over from something else rather than capitalism. So it's a fault of our lagging concepts. So that would be my one, I don't know if it's a question, but retort. And just to comment on what you said about kind of people liking, it makes us feel good to know that something somewhere is happening. So whether it be in Bolivia, or whether it be in the farmer protests in India, or the trucker protests in Canada, we have this idea like there's still somebody somewhere doing something. So the spark of change is still alive. However, I'm just saying what you said differently, I think, is that this is also a defense mechanism that protects us from having to confront our political situation from where we're at, and also prevents actual change. So it's change and affirmation of change elsewhere, potential change. It kind of prevents this kind of negative dialectic from things really taking off in the quote unquote core countries. So I guess, so just the first one in terms of the geography, if not one country at a time or several countries in the same period doing things in a slightly different way, how else does this change ever happen or could happen?
So in the book, I talk about kind of the multilateral strategy and the unilateral strategy. And as strategies for change, these things can work together. The threat of a unilateral strategy can make a multilateral strategy more credible. Mm-hmm. Now, people might sit back and go, well, isn't BRICS a multilateral strategy? It is, but it doesn't include enough high consumption states. It includes too many producer states, petrol states, states that don't have the right position within the world system to be able to produce a truly viable alternative model. What BRICS is enough to do, it's enough to produce a viable model that would allow the Chinese state or the Russian state to survive a period in which these states are excluded from the wider system, or there's an attempt to exclude them from the wider system through, say, the American control over international financial flows, or say the American presence in the Pacific Ocean with regard to the Air Force and the Navy, right? What BRICS is really designed to do is to create a land trade routes in Asia, and ideally also in Africa, that can help to compensate for the limited ability of China to contest control over the seas and the skies with the United States. So that if there is a major crisis over, say, Taiwan that is precipitated by the United States because it wants to draw China into a conflict, that China has a way of continuing to trade and continuing to function. It would be very costly for China to actually have to activate this system. It doesn't want to have to activate it. It has the system in the event that it is necessary to activate it. And of course, it's in China's interest to act as if the system is very, very viable, so that many states will participate in it. And it's, of course, it makes sense for China to frame it that way. But I would say that even if this is a very effective for Chinese purposes approach, its main effect would be to mitigate the consequences of a serious international crisis in the Pacific driven by American policy. Xi Jinping has said he is not going to be foolish enough to be tricked into engaging with the United States in a way that would kick that crisis off, precisely because China has benefited enormously from accession to the WTO. It's benefited enormously from Nixon opening the trade links. It is in no rush at all to disrupt that trade if it can avoid disrupting it, but it needs a plan, needs a contingency plan. If you want to change the system, what you really need is a bloc that includes powerful, rich, consumption-heavy states. So it would need to be a bloc that would be led by the United States and the European Union, because those are the states that have the greatest capacity to consume. Those are the richest states. Those are the states that have the greatest military capability. So if you make a change to the system through those states have the capacity to protect that change. Those states have the economic leverage to trap oligarchic money and seize it or tax it. They have the economic leverage to pressure other states to join that might be reluctant to join. The issue here is that because people have written off the West because of the failures of the last 10 years, they are having to look for a bloc that excludes most of the rich and powerful states. And that is not a viable strategy. If we go back to a two-tier system like we had in the 70s and 80s, that two-tier system may produce a viable second world, but that second world will not be rich enough to compete with the first world. Even with the gains that China has made, that second world would be at a disadvantage and would be looking mainly to survive. And the consequences of a second world system that's looking mainly to survive are very nasty historically, because when you are trying to survive, this forces you to not think in a socialist way. Socialism is about abundance, and it's about sharing that abundance with people. Trying to survive in a pressure situation where you are constantly facing containment and threats from outside, from richer, more powerful states, that is not the way to get a socialism that you want. And I think a lot of people have a sympathy for the Soviet Union. They have a sympathy for Maoist China, in part because they recognize these states as dealing with threats coming from outside, coming from the West, and having to try to navigate this dangerous world. But these people also need to realize that the way that these states navigated it, insofar as they did navigate it, was by becoming extremely suspicious of their own populations, because there were constant attempts to penetrate these states internally, to create dissent. And this goes on now. Putin is constantly worried about foreign money coming into Russia and creating dissent movements internally within Russia. This is going on, and he's worried about the states on his periphery getting paid off effectively, joining the West, getting huge influxes of investment like Poland has and Hungary has. And then that creates a situation where the other states go, hey, how come I don't get to develop that fast? Well, the reason is that Russia is not capable of investing in Ukraine to the level that the European Union is. And that's why Poland is much richer today than Belarus is, or Ukraine. It's not because Poland was always richer or necessarily had to be richer. It's because that bloc is much richer and more powerful. And people are forgetting this. They're forgetting that the Western bloc is still extremely powerful. Yes, the gap between the Western bloc and China is smaller than it used to be, certainly smaller than it used to be. But we're not just talking about the United States. We're talking about the entire Western bloc. It's a very, very integral part of the world system. And if you were to remove that part of the world system, it would be very difficult for that second system to thrive. It could survive, but thriving is another question.
What I would want to say is that this could all be true, but it almost sounds like that you want a risk-free revolution or some sort of. I mean, I get that, but it's that if we wait for a U.S.-led shift or a EU-led shift, we could be waiting for a very long time. And I don't dispute any of the downsides or your assessment about why in terms of second worldism, how vulnerable that is. And also that, of course, these regimes also had to get more and more authoritarianism and that can kind of feed off itself, which also, again, you're thinking, so it's kind of like, how far away from socialism do we have to get, or can we rationalize with the idea that the ends justify the means of somehow getting to this place? But I would also say, is it possible to get to a socialism based on abundance without kind of, making, cracking some eggs for this omelet? I would like it to be, nonviolent. I would like it not to be as have as least suffering as possible. But is that also a kind of fantasy based on what we have to go on so far? And I would push back. I guess it's not really it's just kind of a response to what you said. And also, I think, is there not the choice of that we're kind of making that we're not really willing to see how naked the emperor is? Or are we? And what I mean by that, I'll use an example. I don't want to muddy the waters getting into Israel-Palestine too much. But before October 7th, there was this idea that Israel was invincible. The Iron Dome, the protection of the United States. There was just no way. The military and the backing from the West was just too strong. What can you do? And what we've seen is that, of course, Israel can kill lots of people, and it does still have the official backing of the states in the EU. However, it's not invulnerable. We also know that what Iran showed is that they can penetrate their defense systems. You have a lot of people fleeing now. I don't know how the numbers is out of Israel. I'm not saying that I don't know what's going to happen, but isn't there also the case that we're so convinced, because for the longest time, the United States and the world order since World War II, end of World War II, has seemed so strong that we can only imagine a systematic shift starting from them. And could we also be giving the emperor more clothes than they have? Is that a possibility?
Well, so I'm not saying necessarily one way or the other with regard to violence. I'm not really talking about violence here. I'm talking about which states ultimately have to be involved for something that can produce real thriving to potentially happen. So I think that I'm not saying people should wait. People should look at what's going on in the Western states, try to grasp the dynamics of the internal malaise of the Western states. And there is a malaise. They are sick in all kinds of ways, right? But the sickness of the Western states does not make other states more viable or stronger or more powerful. It just means that there's a less stable international system where there are more morbid symptoms appearing all over the place. It doesn't mean that the Western states are no longer capable or can be cut out of some kind of new scheme. So I would say, people should be looking at the conditions in these states and searching for ways to positively intervene. It's very difficult to find those right now. And a big part of my book is going through and clearing away all of the old strategies that aren't working and haven't worked. That's not to tell people to not think about this anymore, although if that's how you respond, I understand it and I sympathize with it. It's to kind of spur the person who really, really wants to find a real solution to get past all of those old strategies and tactics and to really try to grasp on a theoretical level. Let's make new theory about what's going on in the United States, new theory about what's going on in the European Union, and try to find new ways of constructively intervening. With regard to Israel, I'm not suggesting that the Western states are invulnerable or can't be harmed, or that there is, if there was some kind of showdown, that the Western states would just simply roll and have an easy go of it. It would be very costly to those states also to disrupt this system, very costly. And that is why when states look at the United States and its increasingly rogue behavior, they go, are the Americans nuts? If they disrupt this system, will they not suffer as well? Of course, we would suffer as well. And of course, the European states would suffer as well. But what I would emphasize, especially with regard to what recently happened in Israel with Iran, is that the Iranians, by all accounts, collaborated with the Americans to ensure that their missiles were shot down so that they would not cause more damage to the Israelis. They wanted the strike
5 of the
to be
6 weren't
large in
shot
scale.
down. Yeah. But 5 of the 6 weren't shot down. They hit their targets in the Negev.
Yes, but the goal was to limit.
No.
It
was a proof of concept, I think. Yeah, for sure.
But this was a goal by the Iranians, right? Which is why the Iranians enlisted the cooperation of the United States to make sure the damage would be minimal, so that Iran could say that they fired lots of missiles, and yet it would still be the case that very, very few of them, as a percentage, would
but
kill
Benjamin,
anybody.
let me put it.
And the reason the Iranians did that, I want to finish this point because it's important. The reason the Iranians did that is because they are terrified of Israel and the United States. They want to retaliate, but they do not want to retaliate in such a way that there will be a major conflict with Israel and the United States. The BRICS countries do not want conflict with the West. They are afraid of the West. And the West is, because it's concerned about their growth and development, increasingly is acting in a belligerent way toward them. And I'm sympathetic to the BRICS states because they're in a difficult situation. But when Westerners pretend that these states are on the rise, what they're doing by suggesting that, they're helping the right to portray these states as threats. And that's making it easier for right-wingers to say, well, if the BRICS is this emerging counterpower, shouldn't something be done about it? So there's a dialectical effect there. In trying to sympathize with the BRICS, people are bigging up the BRICS and exaggerating their level of power in such a way that the right will be able to use those arguments to justify belligerent action.
Now, what I would say is that one clarification is that my understand. Are you saying that the only reason why the supersonic missiles that Iran has hit the targets that they did is because the U.S. allowed it or helped them out? Because
I'm saying that the majority of the missiles that Iran launched during that strike were shot down. They were shot down over Iraq. They were shot down in places where it's only possible for the United States to have shot the missiles down with advance warning. The Iranians heavily choreographed the attack deliberately so that most of the missiles would be shot down. It was the goal of the Iranians to minimize the damage. They didn't want to prove that the missiles could hit. They wanted to minimize the damage. The United States knows what Iran's capability is. It's not as if Iran needs to prove its capability to the United States.
Well, I would wonder, maybe I guess, depending on how, if we get an honest answer from the State Department or the Pentagon, Again, I'm not a weapons specialist, but my understanding was that these supersonic missiles, that the air defense systems that most countries have, that all countries have, aren't equipped to deal with them, and that Iran, these are quite expensive. So most of what they put over to when they're on their limited response to, I think it was the bombing of their embassy compound in Damascus. Was that a lot of old drones? So is the idea that, okay, if you throw a lot at the Iron Dome, and then after that you use the expensive supersonic things that I guess they can anyway. The way they move, I don't know. They can that the Iron Dome would be less likely to be able to intercept all of those. And that they did hit, I think, five of the six of those that they used did hit their
I'm not really
target. Now,
focused
no,
on
but
Iron Dome.
yeah. But so what I'm saying is that I think it was to show maybe not the high ups, the military people in the States, but the average people in Israel, that you are not safe because of the Iron Dome. Yeah. So it's like that was a communication, obviously, I have no doubt. I believe that there was obviously the U.S. was like, okay, Iran's going to respond. We want to minimize it. I agree with you that Iran is not looking for a confrontation with the United States. I agree with you there. I don't know if I would agree with the fact that they're terrified, that the BRICS are terrified of it. I don't know if I would say that Russia is terrified with having to confront the European Union, which is basically to confront or NATO, which is basically to confront the United States. I don't think Russia wants to, but I wouldn't say they're terrified to. I think that's
certainly nobody wants to project that kind of behavior. But in listening to the Tucker Carlson Vladimir Putin interview, the thing that comes across over and over is that Vladimir Putin tried again and again, no matter how many times he was rebuffed and humiliated, to get Russia access to the Western Bloc, to get Russia to be admitted to the military alliance, to the economic bloc. It's much, much more dangerous for him personally and for his regime to be outside that bloc. And he tried many, many times to join it. And it is only because he has not been able to join it that he is now trying to construct for himself an alternative bloc. That was not at all his preference. None of these states want to be kicked out. All of these states are very concerned that if they're kicked out, there will be economic disruption that could lead to the fall of the regime or to instability. It's very, very frightening for them. And I don't say that to imply that they're weak or to make fun of them. I say that to sympathize with the very serious situation that those states find themselves in. And I say that to urge people who are bigging up these states to stop helping the right portray them as these threatening states that they can attack, that we should attack, or that we need to weaken. Stop doing this. It's incredibly counterproductive.
No, I would agree with you there that we're so used to, again, growing up, I was born and raised in the States. And it's so used to, like, and in a way, in lots of ways, to a certain extent, capitalism is a zero-sum game. But this idea that somehow a prosperous or more a growing the BRICS getting stronger economically somehow means that the West or the United States is going to get economically weaker. I get what you're saying, especially because most people haven't had the life or the time to know the ins and outs of this. So it's just kind of, all they're going to maybe hear is like, okay, well, China. And when Trump says, China's taking our jobs, China's eating our lunch, this and this and that. And then you have the other side saying, China, China, China. I get what you're saying, that could be why you would suggest that people think through this rhetoric a bit more, especially any public rhetoric that they have. But I think it's interesting because I agree with you that given given history and their experience over the last, I guess, since end of World War II, that we'll just use Russia for example. That Russia wanted to be an equal partner, or at least not an equal partner, but a respected partner in the quote unquote global order or world order, whatever it was, and that for whatever reason the states wasn't interested in that and got the EU to go along for a variety of reasons. But in terms of unintended consequences, so even though the goal was to that they don't want to have this splinter block. They rather be integrated and have a rules-based order that's actually rules-based, that doesn't, rules for you but not for me, and we can turn off the money whenever we want, or a variety of other or the oil and gas, etc. However, the way they've had to respond, both how to deal with being confronting the mammoth military industrial complex you have from the states in the West in aggregate, mainly from the states, and from their control of the international finance, the dollar, reserve currency, and all that. The ways they've had to go around that to survive, to be able to confront, to deal with sanctions and threats, has shown them that, hey, maybe this doesn't have to be. Is it possible? Maybe this doesn't have to be a safe a break in case of emergency, but maybe this could be something that we try to nurture as an alternative. Even though initially it wasn't about creating an alternative, but a safety a way of surviving when all this stuff is going on. If the what is it? I can't remember. Anyway, so they get cut off from dollars, or their accounts get frozen, or whatever it is, the sanctions that, and I'll just use one example because I'm rambling now, but in terms of, isn't the petrodollar coming to an end if it in fact stays gone? Is that not an unintended consequence of how creative China and Russia and other countries had to be to work around whatever the states was trying to do to them? And could this now be something that it wasn't intended to be?
Well, being a petrol state is always a poison chalice, because if you're a petrol state, of course, there's always a market for oil. You will always find states who are willing to buy oil. No matter what the sanctions are, somebody will buy your oil. You are not going to be in a situation where you don't have buyers for oil. The consequence is, if you try to leverage that, then there will tend to be a lack of foreign investment in the other sectors of the economy. The other sectors of the economy will not grow very well. You get an economy that's overly dependent on resource extraction. As climate change is happening, as the world is changing in terms of its energy profile, this increases long-term structural risk to petrol states. So in the case of Russia, yes, Russia can sell oil to countries in Asia through pipelines in Asia, and it can get around US sanctions that way. And the oil can even be sold eventually on to the West by taking it through pipelines that run through multiple states and having it change hands multiple times. Russian oil is not going to have a problem getting to market. That's true. Right? The thing is, if you're going to have an economic bloc that's viable, that can compete with the United States, you need a lot of other sectors that are not like oil to also thrive. China has an economy that has a lot of other sectors. It has an export market where I think around still over 30% of its exports are specifically to the Western Alliance states. The industries that exist in China for that purpose are not designed to make things that will sell internally within the Chinese market, or within the Russian market, or within the market of these friendly states in Asia and Africa. They are designed to make the kinds of plastic garbage that only Westerners buy. So if you disrupt that, a huge part of the economy has to come up with something else to do. That transition period, even if it is eventually resolved, even if you eventually do manage to find other things for those people and for those parts of the economy to do, that means several years of severe instability as the supply chains are changed. And one of the things that we've seen is there's deep, deep fear on the part of people leading all of the governments of the world of the consequences of any supply chain disruption, even fleeting disruption. And we really helped China during the pandemic by boosting consumer spending, because our boost to consumer spending allowed China to reduce its consumer spending by having its people stay home and not spend money. And that allowed a lot of Chinese producers to continue to make money, even though the Chinese economy was largely shut down during the pandemic. That China avoided the very serious costs of the pandemic because it remained in a cooperative relationship with the United States. And in the same way, because the Chinese continued to produce, it continued to be possible to get a lot of goods in the United States that there otherwise would have been shortages of, because that trade continued to flow. And in 2020, imports from China and imports in general in the United States were higher than they were in 2016. what we really need ultimately to actually go in the direction we want is cooperation between the United States and China. We need multilateral approaches in which the United States and China work together to make a world system that is much more functional, that creates future potentiality for further movement in the direction of socialism. That requires a friendly relationship, and that friendly relationship is continuously undermined by both the left and the right.
Okay, but all right. What I would say is that wouldn't you not, maybe I'm just kind of poking holes to poke holes as possible. But I agree with you that the consumption, that the China's goal of developing their own internal consumption based economy is going slower than they would have liked, although there is, a quote unquote growing middle class, or at least there was. But yeah, to be able to swap that out and to think they can rely on internal consumption if they for some reason are if the tariffs and embargoes and whatever else and continue, I agree with you, there'd be lots of pain, and we don't know. And to the degree, and I think this is true, that the degree that the legitimacy of the Communist Party has been based on the expectation of continued economic development, that's a problem for them. So, so I agree with you. They're very key on minimizing economic crises, especially system wide in China. They can't localize or regionalize in some point, whether it be the peasants or workers, or I'm assuming that the middle class is the ones they're probably most interested in keeping happy. But that's another irony. But what I want to ask is that another thing that COVID showed was that the effects of quote unquote deindustrialization also makes these highly rich consumer economies very vulnerable. Yeah, to the countries that are producing the goods that they import, or the modules that they then put together there. So is that a meaningful shift than maybe 30 years ago, before the neoliberalism and things getting produced all over the globalization of manufacturing? The fact that the quote unquote, to the extent that China is still the world's manufacturing center, doesn't that give them leverage they wouldn't have had if the United States, and again, maybe the United States could turn around and go like in a war-based economy and start producing manufacturing the way they did in the 1960s. But isn't that a difference? Or is that
it's not necessary for the United States to bring all of this manufacturing back into itself. It's not necessary for it to do that. All that's necessary is that there be states that are friendly to the United States that will manufacture for the United States at a cheap price.
Okay.
So what the United States has tried to do is not mainly reshoring, although it will talk about reshoring because that will be popular with American voters. It mainly in practice, what it does is friendshoring. So its goal is to gradually relocate manufacturing from China to friendly states. And its goal is to set up a ring of friendly states around China in Asia that will supply it with the cheap labor that it needs to go on engaging in this kind of trade and to continue to have consumer goods manufactured cheaply. So my book, I talk about the slide from Shanghai to Saigon.
Okay.
The goal is to have a state like Vietnam that's small, that is concerned about China because it's very proximate to China. And historically, a strong China often makes interventions into Vietnam. A state like Vietnam wants to benefit from this situation by becoming the state that does a lot of manufacturing for the United States. And there are lots of other countries in Asia and around the world, in Latin America, that would happily take a bunch of US investment to do manufacturing. And one of the things that's changed in the last 50, 60 years is that we have engineered factories to a much greater degree than they used to be engineered, to the point where within about a year's time, you can take a factory in one part of the world, deconstruct it, put it onto ships, move it somewhere else, and set it up. That's not instantaneous. It's still a disruption. It's a full year before that factory can be constructed somewhere else, right? And different factories in different industries take different amounts of time. It's not always exactly a year. But it's become much easier to move factories around. So what the United States will do if there's a long period without conflict without any hot conflict is it will gradually move these factories to other places. Now, people will focus on whether they're being moved to the United States, and they'll argue that because these factories aren't being moved to the United States, or because there are problems when you try to move them to the United States, that it's not working. But that won't be where most of the action will be taking place. It will be in these other states. And the United States will also use friendshoring to try to peel India off. Now, it is the case that many of these factories are only getting set up very slowly, and there are all kinds of problems that they're encountering that are due to cultural differences, right? The manufacturing environment in China is not the same as the United States. It's not the same as India. The labor relations that you're expected to abide by, the regulators and people in the state that you have to interact with, these relationships are different. So it's not something that can happen all at once. However, if there isn't an immediate hot conflict and there is a long period of peace where the United States has a long time to do a combination of friendshoring and reshoring, even as China develops its internal market, the United States will also decouple from China.
Okay, I see. I think that's an important point that I hadn't thought of too much before, and I think that needs to be underlined, is that the idea that we have to realize that, again, when our attention is being focused on the BRICS, or our idea of BRICS, and the kind of the best case scenario, what we're not seeing is all the other stuff that might not be being captured or covered on the mainstream media, or the New York Times and whatnot. And so I agree, if we put our rational actor on and we put ourselves in the position of Vietnam or India, and use like, okay, well, so BRICS is offering us this, what is the US offering us? And also so I get that, and that, so it'd be to be wary of the fact of how ideologically committed and solidarity there is among BRICS plus, or how much of it is like, look, it makes sense for us to be associated with this, but to have one, probably the best position if you do your realpolitik, is to have one foot in both. And to be like, and to see what side of the bread it could be buttered on. So I think that's a very important point, that if people think that that capital and the big players, but they both finance and manufacturing, political, aren't also maneuvering to try to check this or to make it difficult, and that China or BRICS is going to, the Silk Road, or anyway, it's going to kind of naturally sprout unimpeded, that they needed to check that enthusiasm. I think that people would be would do well to keep that in mind. So
related to this is the question of seas versus land power, right? Because it's much more difficult to project power with land power than it is with sea power and air power in today's world. So states that are proximate to China, it's difficult for China to stage a land invasion of these states and make them change policy on that basis. It's easier for the United States to control the oceans than it is for China to use its army to project power in the region. And India and China have a long history of conflict. They've fought wars over a border. Within the last year, there was a serious foreign policy crisis between China and India. And if you read the Indian and Chinese press with regard to that crisis, the Chinese press were issuing passive-aggressive threats to India that were extremely threatening language that they don't tend to use when they talk about Western states. And the Indian press was completely all over itself in Chinophobia. It was extremely hostile to China. This kind of stuff, the internal conflicts in Asia, many Americans, many Westerners have no understanding of the history of Asia. They know nothing about the internal conflicts in Asia. They know nothing about how these states are thinking about China. That's not to say that these states won't consider a deal with China. Many of them certainly will. At the very least, they'll use the possibility of deals with China to extract better deals. And so for many states, what BRICS does is it creates a leverage point that they can use to potentially get more from the Western Bloc. But that doesn't mean they're exiting the Western Bloc. That means a marginally better deal for the states in the Western Bloc. that's beneficial to them, but that doesn't necessarily help create an alternative world system.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that people, again, Kashmir it's really sad. It's another morbid symptom that that doesn't get more press. And I forgot. I really, and then I was wondering if I ever knew this, because I think of Kashmir, I think of not Palestine, Freudian slip, Pakistan and India, but China's also involved in that. And of course, and there's other disputes. And of course, I think what people most people don't realize this, or I'm assuming they don't, is that I totally agree with you that the tools at the US's behest to get the carrots and sticks at the US behest are still seem far and away greater than the ones at BRICS or in China. I agree with I think that's be hard to disagree with, even with the financial craziness and the debt and who knows what. However, I think another thing in terms of going forward is water. And so people in the West, I think when they think about Tibet, when they say free Tibet, they think it's because everyone or the governments are really concerned about the Dalai Lama. And I would say, no, they're really concerned about water because 5 of Asia's main rivers, or maybe all of them, have their source, 4 or 5 have their source in Tibet. And so geopolitically, water-wise, not just for power for dams, but just access to water, there's a reason why, so I have no doubt that China wanted to liberate Tibet from their feudalistic order and didn't want to have, and I have no doubt that wasn't very pleasant for a lot of Tibetans. But I think that what China does have in Asia is their control over Tibet, I think, is something that doesn't get a lot of attention. Now, is that the same as being able to have military bases everywhere, or to be able to cut people out of SWIFT with their national trade? No. But I think that I think there's I just wanted to throw that out there as an example of how there's things we don't know about China and BRICS, and then there's probably lots of things that we don't even know that we don't know that could come into play about how to make a sober assessment of what BRICS means at this point and maybe 5-10 years from now.
Oh, can you imagine if China tried to mess with the flow of the Indus River or tried to mess with the flow of the Ganges? The response from India would not at all be to become more friendly to China.
No,
that would be an extremely, extremely horrible situation. These are sacred
I'm not
rivers
saying they
to many
should.
people.
I'm just saying that it is something.
Right,
in
but
their
see,
quiver.
this is the kind of talk that we end up in when we think in terms of nation states and nation state competition. This isn't the way to create a cooperative bloc.
No, but I just I mentioned it because that China. I'm not saying that China would or should. I'm saying they could. So in terms of we want to look at what carrots and sticks and leverage China has, and as a stand-in for the BRICS, and again the BRICS, like you said, when you look at the relationship between India and China, we got to be careful about how loving that is. In some areas, so whatever. But just that it's not that is one of them. It's no small thing that the biggest source, I think, of fresh water that isn't frozen, or I mean that fresh water is in Tibet. And who controls
if I
Tibet?
were in India and
Tibet.
I wanted U.S. military bases brought to India, I would start talking about that. If I was an Indian politician who wanted to get American military bases in India, I would start going, the Chinese control our sacred rivers. That's what I would be saying. I think that kind of talk, only would strengthen the American position in India.
Yeah, but you don't dispute it, do you? That it's a factor. That's what I'm saying.
I think it would be very costly to try to deflect the flow of major rivers. I think that would be very expensive. It would be something that China would choreograph. It would lead to a major crisis that would lead to major disruption of trade in the Pacific, because the United States would respond to that by coming to India's defense.
No, but you're only seeing it the negative. They can also use it as a positive. We have this, and we are committed that everybody should have fresh water and all this stuff, that we're not going to privatize it. We're not going to have all the bottling companies start popping up at the source of Tibet so they could sell their fancy water. I mean, there's different ways to go about this. Yeah. So, I mean, the privatization of water isn't something that China is at least that I am aware of, is proffering. But
I think
but
from an Indian
yeah.
point of view, China even suggesting that it controls or has the right to the Indus or the Ganges is an extremely offensive idea.
Yeah.
That's what I would imagine. I'm
Yeah,
not
but yeah, I'm not
in
talking
India,
about
but
that. I'm just saying about objectively, Tibet is part of China, and it is the second, maybe, or maybe the largest source of above ground fresh water. It's a lot of things. So I'm just saying that in terms of, I'm not saying that they should do it or that they would. I'm just saying that the fact that, um, you know, I'm just saying it's a factor. That's all I'm saying
oh, it's definitely a
in terms of
factor,
what in
but I
terms
think
of
it's a
in terms
factor that
of yeah,
works
yeah,
toward conflict rather than
yeah.
peace and works toward
Cool.
instability rather than stability.
Unless they say, that we're good stewards of this and it's not just for us but for everybody. I mean, I don't know. I'm just saying
There's
that
no
I
way
think
India will trust them, given that a border war was fought
yeah.
between the two states in the
Well,
70s, and because
also,
of the crisis that just
yeah,
happened there
but
last
don't you
year.
think it's funny that when people think the government that the US cares about that when they talk about Tibet that the US government's main concern is the Dalai Lama?
Oh yes, that's very silly. Of
I mean,
course,
that's what
the
I'm talking about
American
also. It's
government's main
like
concern is not
Tibet
the
is
Dalai
very
Lama.
strategic for very many
Yes,
reasons, the least of which is the Dalai Lama. Although it gives a nice
yes,
face
that's
case to
certainly
it.
true.
That's, that's the thing. Anyway, no, I'm not. No, nobody. No, I'm not suggesting that China weaponizes the Tibet's because of the source of the river. But I'm just saying is that even though they are quite dependent, because I think only 30% of China is arable or arable, whatever they call it, can grow food and whatnot. So I think like 70% of it is mountains and desert and Tibet and all that.
And
Anyway.
that's another long-term structural risk to both India and China. Climate change is very bad for the land in both India and China. Those are states that will be very adversely affected by a large amount of climate change, as opposed to, say, Russia, a state that would stand to, if anything, be a little bit better off in terms of land value.
Look, we have a positive comment, Benjamin. That's always nice. So Moon Unit, she's from. No, I won't disclose her geographical history. But super fascinating dialogue. Thank you, Tara and Benjamin, for covering issues and geographic tensions beyond the usual discourse. Well, you're welcome, Moon. And I'm trying to get her to come on because I've been trying to get her to come on and help me do an episode on the recent Indian elections, but she's being a bit shy. But I'm going to work on you, Moon. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't even hear the last thing that you said because I got excited when I saw the comment button go. So I don't know if you need to repeat it, but
well, I don't remember what it was at this point anyway.
Okay. Anyway, let's see. Let's get into super interesting. I could talk to Benjamin for a long time. I just want to there's one thing I want to get you to comment on because this is when I first realized that you existed. And then maybe what we'll do is I'll just put up some clips I took from X and get your response on it. These are political, your political response on it. But while I'm doing that, because these are going to be more US, maybe entirely US focused. What is your take on the recent was it European Union elections in Europe, and how most of the quote unquote right wing, anti-immigrant, we're told fascist parties had a good night? What significance, if any, do you attribute to that?
Well, I would say first, the states that we tend to hear about, the right had a good night, but there were lots of smaller states in Scandinavia, for instance, where the center left did better than the right. So it wasn't straightforwardly all over Europe that the right did well. Secondly, the European Parliament is a very weak institution. It doesn't have very much power to decide anything. Most of what goes on in the European Union comes through the Commission and through the member states rather than through the Parliament. So when there are elections for European Parliament, there are a great opportunity for people to let off steam, to protest vote, and to vote in ways that will upset elites because there is very little consequence to it. So I wouldn't necessarily take the European elections as a harbinger for what will happen in the national elections. It might be the case that the right does quite well in the upcoming French legislative elections. I think to a certain degree, that would be Macron's preference. Macron has been really frustrated in France recently by Mélenchon's party, which has a large presence in the legislature. The Left Alliance has a big presence. And having to argue with the Left Alliance does not put Macron in a very favorable position. It exposes him as this guy who's trying to destroy pensions and is trying to raise retirement ages and is trying to immiserate people. So he would very much prefer that there be, if he's not going to have dominion over the legislature, that there be right-wing opposition in the legislature, so he can position the center as protecting democracy from the right or protecting France from the right. So I think that the goal of this legislative election is to get rid of the Mélenchon alliance as much as possible. If that is to the benefit of the center party, great, but Macron would rather deal with the right in the legislature than the left.
Okay. So now I'm trying to think of, I think I'll wait to, because I really want to mention your thing about how we need more Engels is on the left, because that was my first when I first noticed the first time I saw you talk on anything, I was like, who is this cool cat? Anyway, but I think I'll end with that, and I'll just start with the clips that I took from the internet, from X, if I can get them. Okay, here we go. So pro-Russian propagandists are sure happy that Julian Assange is free. We should be worried. Pro-Kremlin political figures and far-right extremists are elated about WikiLeaks founder's release, and we should all be on alert. So you're quick, you're off the cuff. Anything that comes to mind that you want to say in terms of morbid symptoms or of our current political situation or yeah.
Well, I think that probably overstates it. I don't think that Assange's release at this point in 2024 makes an enormous amount of difference politically. I'm sure it's nice for him and for his family. I don't think it's very consequential to world politics at this point. I think that we should also bear in mind that this was something that cooperatively happened between the UK and Australia. And then the United States was allowed to save face by having it be a party to the deal. But really, this is an agreement that went on between the UK and Australia. And both the UK and Australia are firmly within the American bloc because of AUKUS, the security deal that they made a few years ago. So I don't think it really signals, say, that the UK and Australia are increasingly not listening to the United States or not friendly to the United States. I think we've reached a point where enough time has passed that the political consequences of Assange being released are not very high. And at a certain point, it just becomes a humanitarian thing to do.
But what do you think about this guy's clearly framing it within the Russiagate milieu? Yes, that's still going on.
There's a constant tendency on the part of these people to try to exaggerate stuff that is not important so that they can pretend that there's this huge threat coming from Russia or some huge threat coming from China, when really these are states that are in difficult spots. You're looking at Ukraine. Well, I really expected Russia to do better in that war than it did. I thought that Russia would be able to take Kyiv, and relatively quickly. And it was astounding to me how the United States, with just a very small amount of funding, very small amount of money, was able to give Ukraine enough weapons to completely stunt the advance of the Russians toward Kyiv. That was really shocking to me.
And but are you sure they wanted to take Kyiv?
Well, they advanced on it, and I think excuses are made after the fact. They clearly
I mean, I don't know. It's not
to denazify the country. You can't denazify the country if you don't take the capital and change the regime. That was clearly in their list of initial objectives, and they moved toward it. They moved forces toward the capital. Of course, now it can be said that all they were really interested in were those regions, and that was a feint to distract the Ukrainians or what have you. I don't buy that for a second. A lot of people thought that they were going to be able to take the capital. And Zelensky was offered an evacuation at the time by the United States. The United States was pleasantly surprised by the ability of Ukraine to resist the Russian invasion. The United States, if anything, was shocked at how able it was to prevent the Russians from taking Ukraine.
Could you say that it's because they didn't want to give credence to all the Putin is Hitler and wants to take over everything, like like some sort of, first Ukraine, then Poland, and everything. The idea that they didn't want to, that they, I mean, I don't know. Again, this is just armchair quarterbacking. But that if they really wanted to take Kyiv, they wanted to, but they didn't want to have that much carnage is a possibility. Of course, they could just say that now. Or also the fact that it really is that how they tell their people and how they and their official reasons for doing it. I always thought my assume is that the red line is they want guarantees that NATO won't join. No, that the Ukraine won't join NATO. I think that's really what they want, isn't it? I mean, that would be my guess. What Putin would settle for is that if the assurances that Ukraine doesn't join NATO, the denazification, all that stuff, I'm sure that I mean, given the history, and that works well with the public. But that's my guess. But again, I have no insight to the inner workings of the Kremlin.
I'm sure that Putin would have taken some kind of deal involving guarantees of non-NATO accession, non-EU accession. That was certainly what Putin said before the invasion. He tried to get a negotiation with Biden to get guarantees to that effect. But then what you tell your population matters. It creates expectations. It creates a sense that if you don't manage to do all of these things, that something has gone wrong. And there has been a lot of talk within Russia about people having made mistakes, things not having gone as they were supposed to have gone. I think it would be trying really hard to big up Russian military capability to suggest that somehow all of this was what Russia originally intended. I think the same would be true to do it in the other direction with the United States. I think the United States was probably prepared for Russia to take Kyiv and for that to be an issue that the United States could use to try to unite the Europeans and to galvanize the public against Trump, who's associated with the Russians.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So what but I would just to push back on that of course what you tell your population matters, but if you recall, the weapons of mass destruction thing didn't pan out. And then how much I don't know what the media ecosystem is like in Russia. I'm assuming it's not that diverse. But if you think about all the things that we know, not just turned out to be wrong, but likely were lies or, serious misinformation, that so far, as you would say, that it hasn't undermined the system as such in the States, that our political leaders and mainstream media continue to gaslight us, even though we kind of know that they are, and they know that we know that they are, but yet it keeps on going. So I wonder unless you're saying that there would be more consequences for Putin not delivering on his promises vis-a-vis Ukraine.
Well, I think that there is always some level of concern about there being a breakdown in civil order in a state like Russia. There's always a concern in these states that the things that the leader is associated with having done, if they for a long period of time are not able to do those things, that could lead to civil conflict. That hasn't happened yet in Russia. So far in Russia, the oligarchs and the military high command have remained largely loyal to Putin, the Prigozhin freakout notwithstanding. I don't expect the Russian regime to collapse. I think if it did collapse, that would be a very bad thing. I think that would cause a lot of instability and chaos. And I think that Westerners who are looking for the Russian regime to collapse are failing to appreciate how hard Gorbachev had to work at the collapse of the Soviet Union to avert disaster and to avert serious civil conflict in that part of the world. There had to be a very, very careful effort made to ensure that warlords and parts of the military didn't commandeer different parts of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. That was a very difficult thing to pull off, and it's not something that should be taken for granted as something that will obviously or naturally happen if there is Russian state collapse now. I don't think that there is likely to be Russian state collapse in the near term. I think that Russia has managed to find enough markets for its oil that it will be able to sustain this effort. But I also think that it will damage Russia's ability to grow its economy in the long run to be under all of these sanctions. And I think that while Russia will be able to survive this, and while the Russian state will be able to survive this, it will not thrive to the degree that it would if it had managed to avoid getting embroiled in this conflict.
Yeah. But speaking of which, I'm sure what happened a few days ago with the they call them bomblets, which is somehow disgusting, that killed some Russians on the beach. I'm sure that helps strengthen the resolve of the average Russian against this effort.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, and I don't know, because I don't have I just go by what I hear on YouTube. But I know Scott Ritter and others have said that to think that that it's a mistake not that oil and gas isn't super important to Russia, but to think that's all they have, or not all they have, but that there has been no diversification. And one of the things that's compelled the diversification is these sanctions, and the other things going on. I mean, I'm guessing they're making a lot of the military stuff inside Russia. I don't know if they're getting a lot from other places. But yeah, and I guess they have taken over some of when the Western companies left, they kind of like took over and like rebranded the McDonald's in Moscow or something. And I don't know how significant this is, or how durable it is. But just to say that there are people who make not the argument that Russia is going to emerge from this an economic powerhouse, but that what the West said would happen so far has not happened. Actually, the opposite seems to be happening to some degree.
Yes, Russia is forced to diversify its economy in response to this situation. But if it then does get reintegrated into trade flows, what it will find is that many of those industries will not be competitive with imports. And this was a problem for the Soviet Union. As the Soviet Union began to open up and trade, it found that many of its internal industries were not competitive. When people say that Russia is a gas station, or they suggest that it's just oil and gas, they don't mean in absolute terms that its entire economy consists of oil and gas exports. What they mean is, relative to the Soviet era, many sectors in Russia are much weaker than they used to be. That's something that, of course, the Russians will try to improve and try to ameliorate, but it will be difficult to do because of limited Russian access to many of the biggest and strongest consumer markets around the world. It is the case, I'm sure, that Russia can produce enough to be self-sufficient in various areas, but that's a very different thing from having a competitive economy that can be integrated into a system of global trade.
Growth, yeah. Okay, I take that. This is an aside, but did you hear that? I can't remember if it was Schultz or who it was, but there was something that came out of the EU, I think, and they're basically just saying that the long-term or that the medium-term goal should be to balkanize Russia. They want to break it down into bits, and I thought this reminded me of the meetings that Europe used to have during the colonial period about who was going to get what part of Africa.
They already did that to the Soviet Union. They already balkanized the Soviet Union.
But did you hear that? Are you familiar with that comment?
Yes, I've heard that argument. I think that's incredibly irresponsible. And for one, it already happened to the Soviet Union, and we are now seeing the consequences of that. When you break up this state, you create a situation where the statelets, the rump state and the statelets, can fight each other. And those fights can be absolutely devastating to the people who live in these territories.
But good money for the people who supply them weapons, and I guess maybe the BlackRocks that come in later. Not that I want to think that BlackRock is, pulling all the strings.
Well, pitting them against each other weakens them. Yeah. Imagine if during the Soviet era, Ukraine SSR had been in a prolonged, protracted fight with Russia SSR. Nobody would say that this was good for the Soviet Union.
No. But I saw that and I was like, calm down, King Leopold. I mean, Jesus, it was sick. I was like, so it's just this weird thing. Speaking of Orientalizing, it seems like all of Eastern Europe, or most of it, and Russia has been totally Orientalized. I mean, and my understanding from Saeed's work, it was mainly kind of MENA, so like North Africa and the Middle East, and maybe all Asia sans Russia, perhaps. But now it seems that we're being invited to see that part of the world in a very, a problematic way. But
West versus rest thinking is very unhelpful.
Yeah, no. Okay, let's see. What else do I have here? These may not be in any. They're not clustered thematically, Benjamin. So, but they are all.
Okay.
Okay, so Natalie Schur, this is in response to the Biden-Trump debate. Just want to float something real quick. Bernie 2024.
The convention delegates won't go for it. They're not going to run another set of primaries. They can't do that. They have a month and a half, maybe almost 2 months before the convention. If they were to open it, it would be what the delegates at the convention would pick. And that would just be it is not at all obvious that that would go well for them. For one, all of the competitive candidates poll no better than Biden, many worse. And for two, if you have a bunch of infighting that splits the party, it can be very, very nasty. The reason we went to the primary system in the States is the riots at the 68 Democratic Convention when Johnson stepped down and they picked the vice president at the convention to replace him, choosing the vice president over other more popular options in the party that don't have support from party hacks and insiders. And this could easily go in a way that's very much like that if they open the convention. It remains my expectation that Biden will be on the ballot. I do not think he will be replaced. If they do replace him, I don't think it will help.
Now, I agree with you because you went as is good because, and you went into the nuts and bolts of the practicalities of how that would possibly play out or why it wouldn't. But to me, in terms of morbid symptoms and just kind of ideological fantasies, that people who still have not let go of the fact that Bernie didn't happen, 2016, 2020, we can still do it. It's like people. I mean, we need something else because we have first as tragedy, then as farce. Now, I don't know what it would be. I mean,
and he made it clear he doesn't want to do it. He endorsed Biden. He endorsed Biden before the primary even took place. He doesn't want a contested election, primary or process. He made that very clear. No, it astounds me how many people want a contested primary, but are still on the Bernie bus at this point because he is the person who killed any possibility of that by coming out and saying at the beginning that there shouldn't be a contested primary.
Yeah, and I know that you are also the host of the LAC, and I'm assuming that by LAC means that you're fairly conversant in psychoanalysis, especially from the offshoots of the Lacanian school, or if there is such a thing, Lacanian left. I mean, for Bernie, I'm leaving Bernie out of it, but just in the kind of political psyche of this group of people, it's like, seriously? I mean, to me, it's structurally the same as the people who can't let go of Hillary not winning. It's like, and you have that as well. I'm sure there's people who are thinking, oh, now, Hillary, she'll be the one that because they can't put in Newsom because Kamala Harris is a woman of color. So they can replace her with a woman, but they can't replace her with a man. They have to replace her with a man of color or a woman who can be white. I mean, in terms of the identity politic scoreboard thinking. But it's like the people who think that, like Hillary lost and it wasn't fair and she would have won, or the same thing about Bernie. They think like this is their chance again. Like thinking that it's 2016 or 2020 to me just seems crazy. But anyway.
Yeah, and Newsom's already got an underwater favorability rating. Newsom is someone that people don't tend to like the more they get to know him. I don't think he's a solution either. The state of California is the epicenter of the cost of living and housing crisis. The Democratic nominee does not want to be associated with the state of California in this cycle. All of the issues that are most important to voters, that are vote losers for the Democrats, Newsom makes people think of all of those issues. And it shows how out of touch these people are that they think Newsom would solve any problem.
Yeah, I think it's just because he can talk well. That's the thing. It's like, well, look, he can talk well, and he doesn't look like he's going to, turn into a pile of dust.
People at least sympathize with Biden. They sympathize with his problems. A lot of people
does he have
really
problems?
feel bad for him and pity him. A lot of people feel that way.
Yeah.
That tweet that he came out with, I may not talk as well or move as well as I used to. There are a lot of people in this country that will find that sympathetic.
Well, yeah, but should he be president? I mean, I don't know. Could he be president? But let's get to that. So did you watch that fantastic debate? I watched half of it and I was like, okay, I can't. I felt physically uncomfortable watching it. I was like, and it wasn't Trump's, his shtick. It was like watching Biden. I was like, this was just uncomfortable for me to watch. So I watched
it was cruel. It's cruel of people to put him on a stage in front of everybody in that condition at that time of night. That was a cruel thing that those people did. And I think they, not deliberately, I think they did it out of wishful thinking. After the State of the Union, they thought that perhaps with adequate prep. The thing is, the State of the Union is reading an address. And we saw after the debate, when there are a set of prepared remarks, he can give those and he sounds as if he's coherent. The issue is if you get him off of prepared remarks and you ask him to formulate words in real time, he can't do that, especially not at that hour of the night.
No. And I remember, so you don't buy the fact that it was a plan. that this was catched up to be able to give them a pretext, because someone was talking again. I don't know if they actually are a medical professional, but I saw somebody talking who works with people who have dementia, who have senility, whatever. And she's like, they could not have set this up worse for Biden if they had tried. Anyone who knows anything about people in these conditions who are, either their cognitive decline or senility, whatever you want to call it, that what they did to him set him up to fail. Not having an audience wasn't good for him. Not having, Trump be able to interrupt all the time wasn't good for him. Not having the screens around that are showing the questions and whatnot was not good for him. And that what they thought, and she goes, either they just didn't know, they didn't have anybody who they consulted with who could give them tips on how to make this as a best environment for Biden as possible, that they actually helped Trump out and helped him out having to let Joe Biden speak for that amount of time. It helped him out not being distracted by the audience, that it actually in a way went to his behavior. So I don't know, but you're saying that you don't believe the fact that this was cooked up by the DNC to allow them to be like, oh my God, we had no idea. This is really, we didn't know that it was so, bad. And then they come on and they cry and say, we love Joe Biden, but this just, he doesn't seem like he can do the job. And that's really sad. And but you're not buying it. You think it was...
No, they don't have that level of internal coordination. There are too many other people in the mix who might come in here. It's too difficult to control. Too many conflicts may come out of it. The Harris people, the people who want a fresh-faced governor, Newsom or Whitmer or Pritzker, the people who want Bernie, these people, people who want Buttigieg or Cory Booker even.
Oh, God, still?
Yes. Yes, if you look at the polling and if you look at the favorability ratings, Buttigieg and Cory Booker both have better favorability numbers than Newsom. And in principle, statistically, are stronger candidates than him nationally.
That might be a winning ticket, actually. Yuck. But yeah, I mean,
I think there's way too much disagreement. The thing is, everybody knows Harris is not a good pick. Everybody knows, and we know this from the primary, that the more voters are exposed to Kamala Harris, the less they like her. There is hard statistical evidence at this point that exposure to Kamala Harris is bad for Kamala Harris's popularity. And a presidential run is continuous national exposure. It's very bad politically. So someone like her, she should have stayed a senator or a governor. That was the right level of attention that someone like her with her set of political skills could handle. She cannot run for president and wage a competitive campaign. All of the insiders know that. And yet they can't just get rid of her because she's the vice president. So if there is a contested convention, there will be a chunk of people, a significant chunk of people who will want to pick her. And how will they convince those people not only not to pick her, but to rally around one particular alternative person? I think that would be very, very difficult. I think their goal with this debate, they didn't think it would be this bad. They wanted to see if Joe Biden could do a debate. They wanted to beta test that early so that they wouldn't throw him out into a debate in September or October, right before the election, and have this happen then. They wanted to figure out if he could debate now. Now they can come up with some excuse to not have him debate again. And Trump can't say that Biden refused to debate him or that Biden was scared of him. That's I think was their thinking. They underestimated how bad he was. They knew there was risk in it, which is why they put it early, but they didn't realize it was going to be this bad. They've drunk enough of their own Kool-Aid that they themselves were surprised.
Okay, that does make sense. So they do get it out early, because this was early. This was the earliest debate I think there's been. So get out early, so whatever damage is done will be kind of in the recess of people's mind. They can give up. They can, again, then the Greek chorus comes out and tells you, kind of models for you how you can interpret what you saw. And then the thing about and then also that, well, then they floated like, oh, he had a cold.
Nobody could have expected Biden to be that bad. That's the worst debate performance in the history of this country. I think it's the worst debate performance in the history of television debates. It was an incredibly bad performance. There's no way they could have expected it to be like that.
Even before he said anything, just how he shuffled out there, and then the content, like the open mouth and the and it's just like. That's it. It's like, I have no love for Biden at all. And I was feeling sorry for him. I was like...
Well, and that's the other side of it. They can try to leverage people feeling sorry for him. And there are
Well,
a
I'm not an
significant
idiot,
number
but
of
I'm not gonna be, I'm
Democrats who
sorry
will be
for him.
moved
I'm
by
going to
that.
vote for him. Yeah.
Yeah, but that will actually work for
Yeah.
some people, because
Oh, good, good.
Democrats are very loyal to their people. They're very
Mhm.
loyal to their candidates and their electeds. They don't behave like European voters. European
Mhm.
voters will say if the party
Mhm.
doesn't win the election, that the leaders are responsible and have to be removed. Democrats will say that the voters failed them and rally to their defeated leaders and
Yeah.
rally to their leaders who are
Yeah,
struck
we're
down.
all ageist. We're all age phobes now. Yeah. No, but it's one thing to feel sorry for somebody and say, okay, I don't want to, I don't want to take that grandpa's license away from him, even though we're going to, someone's going to have to make sure that they could go with him. Or we're not going to, say that he has to retire the John Deere riding lawnmower. It's a different thing to think he should be president of the United States, because then it begs the question, who's making these decisions? It's not him.
Well, he is the president of the United States, and the
Mm.
sky isn't falling. So if you
It's
like
not.
the
Depends who
Biden
you ask and where you
administration,
look, Ben.
well, but for Democratic voters, I'm talking about Democratic voters.
Okay.
Obviously, I think things are terrible. I made that point. I have all kinds of Marxist critiques of the system. But for Democratic primary voters, they have been telling each other, they've been doing the Will Stancil thing for months and months of telling each other, this is the greatest economy ever. This is the most progressive administration ever, right?
What's wrong with
Whoever is making the decisions, they like whoever it is, and they like the
Mhm.
decisions that are being made. Of course, who is making the decisions? As far as I can tell, and only a very small number of news organizations have even bothered to do court politics for the Biden administration. It's all anybody did in terms of reporting in journalism when Trump was in office.
Yeah.
But only Politico, The Hill, a very small number of kind of right-leaning, center right-leaning outlets have done some who's really in charge reporting. That isn't just, is it Kamala or is it Jill, which I think is completely off base. Those people aren't looking at who's in the room for important decisions.
No, Jill has to monitor her husband.
Yeah, she has to monitor him at public events. But it's really a set of old school Biden advisors who have been in the Biden inner circle for a long time, who were with him when he was vice president, who were with him when he was in the Senate. These are people who know him very, very well. They're people that he concocted his political strategy with. And for all intents and purposes, they are an extended part of his mind. And as far as the Democratic inner circle is concerned, if you get rid of Biden, you're getting rid of the Biden brain trust, this group of Biden people that they regard as being very smart and very good and very competent and expert.
So we have a Biden Borg.
They think should not be subject to public criticism because they're doing such a good job and should be kept under wraps. I mean, they don't think that those people should be democratically scrutinized. This is a party that consists mainly of people who say, trust the experts. Yeah. And the Biden inside team is the expert team that Biden trusts, and he trusts the right people. And that's how they think about it. I don't agree with any of that, but that's how they think about it.
So just to reiterate, Lydia Palgrave in the New York Times, when she wrote Kamala Harris could win this election, let her, you're saying, smoke another one.
I think that
you already said why, but I just wanted to.
Yeah. That's just not tethered to reality.
Yeah. And Pitt, we have another comment from, this is from YouTube. They might replace Biden simply to preserve long-term legitimacy and credibility of the Democratic Party, not for 2024. Do you have any?
Have a bunch of delegates at a convention go and sit in smoke-filled rooms and choose the Democratic nominee like the Pope. That will restore confidence in the Democratic Party as an institution. Yeah, have a Vatican-style nomination process. That will make everybody feel great about democracy. Are these people nuts? Are they crazy?
Well, I don't know. I mean, let's not be, Pitt might have been, that was an honest question. So, but yeah, so we were thinking no. So to think about it in that way, and again, this is really what Benjamin just did there. If I may call you Benjamin, I am older than you. We're both doctors, not of medicine. Anyway, excuse me, is that to think of it that way. So to say that this to have any kind of legitimacy, that they're not just trying to gaslight us and tell us, that Orwell quote, "Don't believe your eyes and ears. It was the party's last and most whatever important or whatever a requirement." is that okay? But how this would happen is that they would have to go to the national convention, and then no one would know what's going on behind the scenes. And this, and then it's basically, again, we already think, or a lot of people already think, and I think there's reasons for this, that after Bernie did well after the second or third primary, and then all of a sudden Buttigieg drops out, and that other lady, I can't remember her name, but all these people drop out and galvanize around Biden, even though he had not been the strongest performer in that thing. That who's gonna pick? So we have the Obama wing, and we have the Clinton wing, and then we have the Biden Borg, or whatever you want to call them, and they're gonna have to hash out, I guess, the major donors to decide who are we going to put up. And what you're saying is that in of itself, when we're thinking about democratic legitimacy, isn't going to help with the legitimacy problem. It's just a different legitimacy problem they have dealing with Biden. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and this gets back to the book. People have very different understandings of what democracy means for them and what they want out of democratic procedures and institutions. So the stuff you do to try to shore up legitimacy with one person or one type of audience or demographic often undercuts it or undermines it with other demographics. And for especially the Biden people, this would be an undemocratic attempt to unilaterally change the rules of the nominating process to shaft their guy, unless he steps down of his own volition. If you were to open it without his having stepped down, you would be shafting him. And then even if he does step down, then you have to deal with Harris as the presumptive person that the Biden people would be expecting you to pick, and the huge, huge trouble that would come. And maybe even some of the Biden people don't like Harris. What I understand is that they tend to marginalize her from meetings. So some of them might not support her and might want somebody else. Maybe, who knows? It could be any of those guys. The difficulty with this is it really does work like the election for the Pope. If people know about the election for the Pope, you have a series of votes until somebody gets enough votes. And each time you don't get enough votes, you have to vote again. And then there's time in between each votes where people can make backroom deals and talk to each other off camera.
Horse trading. Yeah.
Right. And you get to see the votes. The votes are on TV because at this point it's televised, right? So you'll see everybody vote, but then whatever happens in between the votes, you won't be privy to.
And we'll tell ourselves it's transparent.
And oftentimes you end up with somebody that nobody likes, but is a compromise among the elites. And that's how we got Humphrey. That's how in the Republican Party in 68, they got Nixon. Hillary Clinton attended the Republican convention in 68, and she cried because the Republican Party elites stole the election from her preferred candidate, who was Rockefeller, who was a billionaire from New York, one member of the oil family, right? She wanted Rockefeller because she was a Rockefeller Republican with liberal positions on social issues but conservative on the economy, and they nominated Nixon. And oh, how could they? Yeah. And then there was rioting at the Democratic convention. This is why they changed the rules, because this is a process that the public came to really loathe. And I think people, it's been a while now, and people don't remember how much everybody loathes this process. It's a process that doesn't enjoy any legitimacy, and that's why it's gone. I will say this: it was a process that made it a lot harder to get people into office who were interested in marketing themselves to the public in a way that would alienate members of the core of the party. It became a lot easier to
make Trump's unlikely.
It became a lot easier to run in a primary, get votes from primary supporters, and alienate and agitate people in central leadership. And that was how the Reaganites took over the Republican Party. The Republican establishment in the 60s was very anti-Reaganite. Nixon called him a dumb guy. Used the word dumb to describe Ronald Reagan. The changes to that process facilitated the Reaganization of the Republican Party.
Crazy like a fox. Yeah. I don't know. Okay, so let's see. We have a few more. Let's see how many we can do before we exhaust Benjamin completely. Let's see. Here we go. This is Ryan Grimm's book, I think. So, The Squad, AOC and the Hope of a Political Revolution. Squad. What's going on with the Squad?
Still on this? And the Squad, so I talk about this in chapter 2 of my book. If you have a strategy for winning power that involves trying to win in Democratic safe seats, in heavily gerrymandered House districts where Republicans aren't competitive, right? And you do that because you want to minimize the financial cost of fielding a competitive candidate. So if you only have to contest a primary, your costs are going to be much lower than contesting both a primary and a general. And it's going to be cheaper to run just a primary campaign than, say, just a general campaign. The cost of this is that all of your competitive candidates are in these weird districts that are demographically very different from the country, that are politically very different from the country. So the stuff that those candidates will say, the kinds of lines, the kinds of rhetoric that they will become accustomed to using to win in their district will be heavily at odds with what's popular nationally. And then the right-wing media, Fox and so on, will give enormous amounts of coverage to all of those statements so that they can smear the movement nationally and prevent it from growing. And this is why I regard the Squad as a totally Pyrrhic victory. Leaving aside what then went on to happen, which is that the Squad abandoned many of its core left-wing positions, stopped talking about Medicare for all. They betrayed the railroad strikers by supporting the imposition of a deal on them. These are unforgivable sins from the point of view of anybody who has any kind of socialist leaning. So in addition to being useless, their whole campaign strategy was counterproductive in itself. And so when people are continuing at this stage to write books acting like the Squad is has some kind of positive revolutionary potential, this to me says that either these people are not paying attention or that they are not interested in my political project. And Ryan Grimm is someone I would consider to be not interested in my political project.
Probably not. No. Okay. So let's see. What do I have here? I'm trying to, I have, okay. Okay. I'll read this. So this is Barack Obama letting the soldiers know how to respond. Bad debate. And I can't do impressions. So I'm not going to try to do a Barack Obama. Bad debate nights happen. Trust me, I know. This election is still a choice between someone who has fought for ordinary folks' entire life and someone who only cares about himself. Between someone who tells the truth, who knows right from wrong, and will give it to the American people straight, and someone who lies through his teeth for his own benefit. Last night didn't change that, and it's why so much is at stake in November. JoeBiden.com. And all I have to say to this is liar, liar, pants on fire. Is Trump a liar? Yeah. Is Biden a truth teller? Okay. Benjamin, Studebaker.
And they both constantly obfuscated about the role of COVID in totally shaping both the end of Trump's presidency and the beginning of Biden's. So they both tried to use statistics about how things changed while they were in office. And then the other one would go, well, what about COVID? So they both know that COVID makes all of those statistics nonsense. Nevertheless, they both tried to argue from them, which shows contempt for the public on the part of both of them. As far as this goes, I also noticed that Hillary Clinton made a tweet that was rather similar to this one.
They all did.
Also very much, to see that from both Hillary and Obama, to me, is very indicative that nobody's going to make Biden drop out. If he does, that will have to be something that comes from him and from his conversations with his wife. Bill
waves in. Here we go. Bill, tell us how to what we saw and what we didn't see. I'll leave the debate. Okay, I'll leave the debate right now. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it, Tara. Okay, I'll leave. It's so tempting to think I have abilities that I don't. Okay, I'll leave the debate. This is Bill Clinton. I'll leave the debate ratings to the pundits, but here's what I know. Facts and history matter. Joe Biden has given us 3 years of solid leadership, steadying us after the pandemic, creating a record number of new jobs, making real progress solving the climate crisis, and launching a successful effort in reducing inflation, all while pulling us out of the quagmire Donald Trump left us in. That's what's really at stake in November. You buying it?
And that is, I think, how the core of the Democratic base is going to think about this. They like what the administration has done, so therefore they like the brain trust. The fact that he is that bad in the debate just means that there must be some kind of brain trust behind him that is doing a good job, and that's how they'll rationalize it. They'll say, well, of course he can be president. He has been president, and we've liked it.
But they're forgetting that, and maybe not. This works with blue MAGA. Some people use that as a term for the blue no matter who. But they're forgetting, or maybe they're forgetting, I think they're forgetting that Donald Trump is not an unknown entity now. There was a 4-year Trump presidency, and the sky didn't fall. And I'm not saying that I'm not a fan of Trump at all. I think he's useful in terms of what he makes apparent, or makes more apparent, that makes it more difficult for people to turn away. I think he's a symptom, not any kind of random, bug in the system. However, he's a known entity. They can't really say that, or they can, and the choir will respond to that, like, yeah, that nothing, like, Trump is Hitler and whatever. But for people who aren't in that sect, they have an idea what you get with Trump. And they could also tell themselves now, I can already hear it, well, he's learned more. He won't make the mistake of having so many swamp creatures around him. He knows how the sausage is made. And like somehow this Trump is going to be, the Trump that we wanted. Because still people around him, I've seen, like, anything bad about Trump, the Trump people will blame on somebody else, right? So either it was the media's fault, which of course the media didn't do many favors, or the deep state, or whatever, or it was because of Mike Pompeo, or it was because of John Bolton, or it was because of whoever, never Trump. But wouldn't you say that maybe that's a factor, that the blue, no matter who people are forgetting, is that there's a limit to how much they can scare people about Trump, given that we had a 4-year Trump presidency?
One of the interesting intersections between the Biden people and the Trump people is that both of them claim that Trump has learned a lot. They have to both claim that, because the Trump people have to persuade their guys that it will actually make a difference this time. Mm-hmm. And the Biden people have to persuade their guys that he actually poses a threat in a way that he previously didn't. And they do this often by suggesting that he lost his mind on January 6th, or had some kind of fundamental moment of becoming a different kind of person, mm-hmm. or what have you. Or that this is what he intended all along, and it was revealed what his true nature was on January 6th, and now you can expect a different kind of thing. I think what all of this ignores is that it's not really about what Donald Trump wants to do, or what kind of character he has, or what his internal motivations are. It's a question of, can the president oppose the civil service, the bureaucrats, the intelligence services, the army? Can he govern the country with the leaders of these different parts of the state in opposition to him? The right all the time loves to blame the deep state, but if the deep state is a problem, well, how would you deal with it? They go, well, this time he's going to purge them. Really? He's going to be able to tell who is an FBI agent and who isn't. Every movement
who's a good one and a bad one
has tried to oppose the federal government, or to change or modify in a serious structural way the federal government, has had to deal with being infiltrated by agents of the CIA and FBI. It's an extremely difficult thing to do, because intelligence agencies are very good at pretending to be people they're not. So it's very, very hard to sort out who is a spy and who isn't a spy. So when you openly oppose the intelligence services, and he's declared the leaders of the CIA, leaders of the FBI to be his enemies, they've said that they, openly, former leaders of the CIA and FBI have said that they worked against him. Loads of people throughout the civil service and bureaucracy leaked against Trump throughout his presidency. And these leaks were a continuous problem for him. And people think that because of this, plan that he has to fire people, that's going to solve this problem for him. On either side, either people who are scared of that plan, or people who are advocates of that plan, they're both completely out of touch with reality. I think the reason that most ordinary people find this election so dispiriting is that they know that their lives were not very good when Trump was president, and they know that their lives haven't been very good when Biden was president. And at least in other elections, they might imagine that one of the candidates might do something new because they're a new face. And now people don't even have that to give them some level of succor or comfort. It's very sad. The whole thing is very sad. And the ways in which people try to psychologically protect themselves from confronting it, I feel so bad for people that they're in a state where they feel like they have to do that.
Yeah. And I think also, again, defense mechanisms, for lack of a better word, this idea that it's just some bad actors. Yeah, if you fire the right people and hire the right people, then the system as such, or the basic coordinates are fine. You just got to tweak it here, tweak it there, or you moralize. If you get a bad person in, then whatever. So I think there is that rationalization as well. But yeah, and I think also, I mean, one thing that this Trump thing from 2016 on has really shown is just the rank hypocrisy. So, and the switch from when it used to be more of a left issue to be critical of the quote unquote deep state and the intelligence agencies and all that, but when they do this towards someone we don't like, then it's fine. you know it's fine because it was Trump, so we're glad they did it. It's like, well, I mean, it's just in with the censorship and the quote unquote hate speech, and now they want everyone to love everyone. Like somehow it's the government's job to tell everyone who they like and dislike and what they find interesting or not, and all this stuff. Because I mean, I think when they first started saying Trump derangement syndrome, I thought, okay, well, but as time went on, I thought there's something to that. I'm sure it wasn't just that; it was already there, but it kind of congealed it to the idea that once Trump was mentioned, then if the generals ignored what the president said, that's fine. If the CIA was was involved in the P tape or the Steele dossier, whatever, that also fine. FBI also fine. When they would crap their pants if someone was doing it to quote unquote one of their guys. I mean, it's just, I don't know. People want to say this is the left, but it's no left I want to be a part of. I can tell you that. Anyway,
it's really a party of the bureaucratic part of the state. It's a party that supports the administrative part of the state, the bureaucrats, the technocrats, the experts, the unelected people who are there because they have degrees or specialized expertise in policy areas. And a lot of Democratic voters are people who have degrees in these kinds of areas at this point. They're professional workers who are administrators, who are bureaucrats of one kind or another, managers of one kind or another. That's really who that party is increasingly gravitating toward. I think it's especially sad with respect to what all of that gatekeeping has done to the media, because the left, in supporting the center and trying to gatekeep and push out the right, allowed the center to alter the internet media environment in such a way that it's now extremely difficult to make money by talking about politics unless you continuously engage in outrage, in personal accusation, in very nasty, belligerent types of rhetoric. It's very hard to get a lot of clicks. And what this means is that all of the most successful media outlets now are foaming at the mouth with search engine optimized, outrage-oriented content. And this is terrible for the discussion. The political economy of our political discourse has been destroyed. People talk about the discourse, oh, it's so uncivil. Why is it like that? It's because it's no longer possible to run a business of talking about politics that does not produce that kind of content. Anybody who tries to have a more interesting or complicated discussion has to do it as a charity project.
Yeah. No, it is. It is great. So, just in terms of the ideological fantasies and why we gravitate to this notion, even if we hate the person in charge, we really rather believe that somebody's in charge rather than that nobody's in charge. And I think this is another example of that. So, will Obama pull the plug on Biden? So, again, I think that even though people would hate, or probably would think they would hate, the idea that Obama or Team Obama has all this power, there's a comfort in this fantasy that Obama's pulling all the strings, that he's the one and true kingmaker, queenmaker in the Democratic Party, that it isn't all this other stuff and the things that we've been talking about. And your book goes into the great detail that can account for the morass or how stuck we are. But no, it's Obama, or on the other side, who knows who it is? It's whoever they think's behind Trump now. I don't know, that Adelson lady who's going to give him $100 million, or it's just, he just really, I mean, whatever it is. But this notion, I think what would scare people is if we were to somehow actually be able to pull the curtain back and see that it's empty, that all it's there is our projections of anxieties and dreams and whatnot. Which isn't to say there aren't really powerful people and forces, but the idea that there's somebody who really, like, the subject's supposed to know and be in control actually exists, I think is something that we all have to realize how vulnerable we are to that. Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, people want a person, there to be some personal face. Even if the system is evil or bad, they want it to have a personal face so that there's something human about it. An impersonal system of structural imperatives and incentives that make people do things they don't want to do, that's much more terrifying to people, because then it seems very difficult to escape it. I think with regard to Obama, it might be the case that Obama could have a phone call with Joe Biden and convince Joe Biden to stand down. That might be the most that Obama could do. It wouldn't entirely surprise me if he could do that. The issue is that he would not then be able to control the nominating process. And people used to understand this. Back when the nominees were always picked through the convention, a lot of the time, there was more than one vote at the convention. Well, why was that? Because people didn't agree about who the nominee should be, even within the party. Even the higher ups within the party, they had disagreements, right? And so there was at least some awareness that the party is not some kind of collective mind that always does always acts in concert in a totally coordinated way. But that's how you could have the rioting at the convention in '68. You could have these enormously nasty disputes. The primaries are there because there is plurality within the parties, and there's a need to work that plurality out early enough on that you can then run a competitive campaign. And once one party goes to that system, the other party is at a disadvantage. If it picks its candidate 2 months before the election and has a bunch of public infighting that occurs through the Vatican process of the convention, that's why both parties did this.
Yeah, and for some reason this is lost. I don't know if it's because of the media that we've gone from I don't know, it's because it's screen rather than text, or the soundbite, or I'm sure there's a configuration of factors that go into the fact that most people have no idea about what you just said or have forgotten.
Yeah, and you can get a ton of clicks in a weekend by acting like this is going to happen. If you say, who's it going to be? And you can get a ton of clicks. You can get a ton of likes and retweets and all of that. By just playing into each of these moments and treating each of these moments as an existential moment. And that's what the media is incentivized to do. It's not incentivized to educate anybody about the history of the country. And increasingly, it doesn't do that. And it's been a long time. 1968 was a long time ago. People don't even remember the way it used to be.
Before I was born, thank God. I'm not that old. Yeah. Anyway, I have before we wrap this up, I do want to share with the audience how I came to know of Benjamin's existence. And it was at this 2002 Platypus convention. And I was watching something on YouTube, and so I was watching the panel that you were on. And I was like, who is this cool, quirky cat? Because these types of things tend to have, and I mean that in a positive way. Yeah. These things tend to have the usual suspects, a lot of gray beards and whatnot. And I would encourage everyone to go to benjaminstudebaker.com, and you can look at this. And there's links to the videos of these panel discussions, as well as I think a annotated or slightly revised transcript. But one of the things that I remember that I always, that I always associate with you, and let me pull down my little branding thing here. Let's see. I need a technical producer. So this is one of the things that you were talking about. And I don't know if it was about liberalism and Marxism, or the millennial left and Marxism, or something. I don't know if you want to read this out, or if you feel weird reading your own self, but I can read it out, or you can.
I'm happy to read it.
No, please do.
Yeah. Workers have so much of their time and energy taken from them every day. The Democrats' human infrastructure bill calls for huge amounts of money to be poured into childcare. Workers don't have time to care for their own children anymore, much less read the news, much less become Marxist, much less found authentic working class Marxist organizations. The American working class is the American subaltern. You know what's missing? Friedrich Engels. We need Marxists who are so loaded that they don't need to participate in the market. They're the only people who are free to create a form of left-wing politics that does not depend on the culture war. But can such people be found? Do any of you have an enormous pile of money? Do any of you know anybody with an enormous pile of money? Even at beautiful, posh universities like Cambridge, Chicago, and Northwestern, these people are hard to find. And most of them don't want to fund Marxism. They want to protect their wealth or go to space. Yeah, I
So
remember
yeah,
doing that one. That was fun.
it was so hilarious in a good way, because another thing is that, again, I don't want to get oops, sorry, I didn't mean to cancel you there. To God bless the graybeards, but it's just like, I don't know about you, but I first came to whatever you want to call it, Marxism, in university. Yeah. So in terms of the critique of political economy, so theoretical stuff, right? And then it was afterwards I thought, well, I want to go. I knew there wasn't a lot of communists or socialist parties in the States, but when I lived the place I lived abroad, except for India, that was a bit different. But I thought, oh, I want to go, and see what's going on. So when I was doing my fellowship at Oxford, I thought, oh, I started seeing these things about Oxford socialists or whatever, and so I thought, I'm going to go and see what these people are about, and it was so depressing. And I mean, they were nice, but they're kind of kooky. I mean, and still thinking that if people could just read Lenin the right way, or read Capital One the right way, and what they would do, they couldn't. So far, they haven't been able to generate anything on their own. They wait for something else to pop off, and then go try to hand out their their flyers and whatnot. And that was also why, when I started getting asked, when I'd have some exchanges with people, either online or in person, and they were trying to place me like, what kind of socialist are you? And I finally realized that meant, like a Trotsky or Stalinist. And I was like, this was totally foreign to me, because of how I came in, how it is that I came into, I learned about Marxism and that whole canon and everything after that in a university environment. And so I might have had some kind of radical, off the book clubs or something, but it wasn't in a political organization or a political movement. And I think those things could be quite different. So when I heard you talk this way, not that you're not also, a theorist and whatnot, but it was just so refreshing. I'm like, yeah, can we have some humor? Can we just kind of, shake things up a bit? So I really appreciated that. And I don't know. And it was, so anyway, I would encourage people to, look at that, because also the panel that you were on with, was it Eli Wiesel? I can't remember his name, about liberalism. I thought I also liked the way you kind of condensed that into, okay, these are what liberalism is, and to get a handle on what is what's cool and not cool about that, and how it's not about. I think it's also important, at least for me, that we're not talking about, at least I don't want to put words in your mouth, about abolishing liberalism, civil rights, political rights, the Constitution. I mean, in terms of large parts of it, obviously there were issues, are things we'd want to retain, but the hardcore individualism, the making this idea that markets are always for everywhere and for everything, the best way of organizing things, are things to get rid of. But anyway, I don't know if you want to add any more of this. I don't know if you found a Friedrich Engels. I know I haven't. I'm on the lookout for a patron, so I don't have to go and be a wage slave anymore and hold my tongue at universities. But so far
there are really
I
only
have
4
no Engels.
patrons, right? There are really only 4 patrons a person can have: your parents, your partner, a person, an oligarch, or an institution. Those are really the only 4, and there are advantages and disadvantages to each. And we all have to kind of, if you're talking and you want to make a living by talking, somebody has to do the work.
Pay for it. Yeah.
Right? Somebody has to. And therefore all of our talking has to be justified to the people who ultimately support and fund our talking. And that is important. And it does, and it needs to be. But you need to have the right patrons so that you have the right incentives. And it's something I think everybody should think about. And coming from a family where you have parents who are willing to help you, and they love you, and they think well of you, is a very good way to have a lot of autonomy. It may not be high status, but it's a good way to have a lot of autonomy. I think it's underrated. But yeah, on this point about, you mentioned people who are always talking about trying to read texts from the past in one way or another. I think that one of the big problems that we have is an excess of textualism, an overfocus on texts rather than action, and what action feels like for people, and what makes people act, what drives people to act. And people can do this, can get textual about this too. They can over-theorize action to the point at which it's just, again, another form of textualism. But I think there are a lot of traditions that have done a good job of focusing on, what actually motivates someone to do something. I think Marx himself was like this, although many Marxists are not. I think that there are in many different traditions around the world this focus on what's actually necessary. How do you create in people capacities to think in certain ways, capacities to act in certain ways in actual life, not by just convincing someone of an argument or getting someone to read a book in a certain way. And I think that's something that a lot of theorists have lost sight of, in part because it's so much easier to think that you're achieving something as a theorist if you think that winning textual arguments is political action. People who think that if they can just define liberalism, liberty, or equality, or representation in the right way and create a consensus around their definition, that will deliver change. Those people, I think, are really, really lost in a sea of academic sludge. And I sympathize with them because I understand the temptation to do that. I think all us academics have that temptation. There was one other thing I wanted to say in reference to that point. It was a great, yes. So I like to say sometimes that I am a non-liberal pluralist. So the pluralism part of liberalism, the letting people talk and letting people interact and have different ideas and associations and so on, I'm fine with pluralism. My issue is that the market is an anti-pluralist structure because the market imposes a competitive dynamic that makes many different ways of living and acting uncompetitive or unsustainable, right? So when I talk all the time about the global economic system and capital mobility, what I'm talking about is this system of competition at the level of trade that narrows the set of possibilities for the states and for the individuals subject to that system and brings out of them a conformist behavior, right? The liberals say they're for pluralism, but because they only view the market as the only legitimate mechanism for distributing stuff, their pluralism is always curtailed by what the market actually permits. And if they don't like the things that are coming out of the market, they of course modify it and change it to suppress the stuff that they don't like. So we can't just treat liberalism as this entirely coherent thing that fits together neatly. These different parts of it, the individualism, the market structure, and then the pluralism, those are all different parts that don't necessarily have to go together, that can be detached and reframed and used in different ways. And part of the work of political theory is to overcome these barriers to imagination that force us to think, oh, if I want a pluralist society, I have to agree with the market. I have to be pro-market to be pluralist. And that's just not true.
Well, on that note, I think we should probably wrap it up. Thank you so much. You've given us, the royal us, almost 2.5 hours. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed this discussion. And I think it's also nice that obviously we're in the same universe, but we're not, our points of view and ideologies don't form a perfect circle, which is nice. But also, we didn't call anybody a name. Went off enough. He didn't call me a Fed. I didn't call him a Fed. I mean, so all in all, I think that we've also modeled, how to have a rich discussion with some humor. So I really appreciate that, Benjamin Studebaker, and I hope that this is not the last time that we find ourselves in some sort of repartee, if I'm using that word correctly. So before we sign off, is there anything you want to wrap up with before we sign off here?
Well, it was a pleasure. It was a lot of fun. You brought up lots of different interesting things to talk about. We went all over the place. It was great. There was so much variety to it. I had a good time.
Great. And that reminds me, I'll have to put in some detailed timestamps in the in the thing. And also, I just want to say for people who are looking to look at the Rumble, for some reason this didn't work on Rumble, but I will put up, I will post this video on Rumble as well. But we did go live on X and YouTube. So Rumblers, it's coming. Sorry, but I don't know. Anyway, thank you, Benjamin. I am proud to call you comrade, if I may, in the broadest possible terms. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Take care. Oh, wait.
Oh.
So sorry. The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy is his book that's out now. Please go visit benjaminstudebaker.com. You can also see those videos, panel discussions from the 2002 platypus thing. I encourage you to do them. They were quite, I enjoyed them. And Benjamin really, anyway, that was when I was like, who is this cat? Anyway, so I'm sure that if what you saw today didn't make you think that he's someone you want to pay attention to or get his insights from, if you've seen this, then you also watch those 2 videos. I'm sure you'll become a fan, which of course doesn't mean to swallow everything he says whole. He is, we're all human, but a good guy. See you next time, Benjamin. Take care.
Bye-bye.
So, right. That was a great podcast. I'm really glad he was able to come on and give us 2.5 hours of his time. Again, please do check out his website. He has all his think pieces there, and also video links and whatnot. And I hope that we have Dr. Studebaker back on again sometime soon. And speaking of patrons, I don't have an Engels. I would like to have one. If you'd like to support this podcast / media company, we're also on Substack. Please do so. The easiest way, the freest way you can, is just to like and subscribe, either our YouTube on Rumble and X. That helps us with the algorithm. And those of you who can throw a few coins our way, that's much appreciated, because we would like to be able to have a couple podcasts a week and also at least one Substack a week. But on that note, thank you very much, and I will see you next time. Keep hope alive, people.